The ink on the divorce papers was still wet, glistening under the fluorescent lights of the boardroom. Richard Dalton sat back in his leather chair, a smirk playing on his lips, believing he had just pulled off the heist of the century. He wasn't just leaving his wife of 20 years. He was leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a broken reputation. He watched her pick up the pen, her hand trembling, or so he thought. He expected tears. He expected begging. But when Catherine finally pressed the pen to the paper, the room didn't explode in sorrow. It exploded in shock. With a single elegant loop of her signature, the balance of power didn't just shift, it shattered. Richard thought he was signing a divorce decree. He didn't realize he was signing over his entire empire. Richard Dalton adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit, staring out from the 45th floor of the Dalton Holloway skyscraper in downtown Chicago. The city looked like a circuit board from up here, a grid of energy that he felt he controlled. At 52, Richard was the epitome of American corporate success. He was handsome in a silver fox sort of way, ruthlessly efficient, and as of this morning, ready to cut the final tether to his past. "Is the paperwork ready, Bradford?" Richard asked, not turning away from the window. Bradford Keynes, a lawyer whose morality was as flexible as his hourly rate, sat at the mahogany conference table. He tapped a manicured finger on the thick stack of documents. "Ironclad Rick. We've leveraged the pre-ENUP from 2004. Since Catherine hasn't been employed in the last 15 years, and considering the emotional distress clauses we've fabricated regarding her, let's call it instability. She'll be lucky to walk away with the summer cottage in Maine, and even that has a lien on it." Richard turned a wolfish grin, spreading across his face. "And the shares, untouchable," Bradford assured him. "The voting rights for Dalton Holloway remain 100% yours. She gets a small alimony stipend for 3 years. Then she's on her own. It's brutal, Rick. Even for me." "It's necessary," Richard corrected, walking over to pour himself a Scotch neat. "Catherine is a ghost, Bradford. She wanders around that empty mansion like a piece of furniture I forgot to sell. She's boring. She's aged. And quite frankly, she doesn't fit the brand anymore." The brand was currently waiting for Richard in a hotel room at the Peninsula. Jessica Reed, 28 years old, sharp as a tack, and possessing the kind of hungry ambition that Richard found intoxicating. Jessica was his VP of communications, and for the last 2 years his mistress. She was the one who had convinced him that Catherine wasn't just a wife. She was an anchor dragging him down. "She's going to be blindsided," Bradford noted, closing the folder. "You know it's her 50th birthday next week, the gala." "I know." Richard took a sip of the scotch. "That's exactly when we serve her." Bradford paused. "At the gala. In front of the board. The donors, Rick, that's nuclear." "I want it public," Richard said, his voice dropping to a growl. "I want witnesses. I want her to be so humiliated, so broken, that she signs whatever we put in front of her, just to make the staring stop. If we do it in private, she'll fight. She'll get her father's old cronies involved. But if I break her publicly, she'll fold." It was a cruel calculation, but Richard Dalton hadn't become a billionaire by being kind. He had married Catherine Holloway 20 years ago, when she was the shy, soft-spoken daughter of the company's founder, old man Elias Holloway. Elias was dying, and he needed a shark to run the company and protect his little girl. Richard had played the part of the devoted protégé perfectly. He married Catherine, took the CEO spot when Elias died, and slowly, methodically erased the Holloway name from the letterhead, replacing it with his own. He thought he had erased Catherine too. He thought she was just a socialite who lunched, gardened, and looked the other way. He was wrong. 3 miles away, in the sprawling estate of Lake Forest, Catherine Dalton sat in her greenhouse. The air was thick with the scent of orchids and damp earth. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pacing. She was pruning a bonsai tree with the precision of a surgeon. "Ma'am?" Catherine didn't flinch. She snipped a microscopic twig before turning to face her housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. "Yes, Martha. Mr. Dalton called. He said he won't be home for dinner. Again. Something about the Asian markets opening." Catherine smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was a practiced expression, a mask she had perfected over 2 decades of high society dinners. "Of course. Thank you, Martha. Actually, could you call Emily? Tell her to meet me in the library in an hour. Use the burner phone." Martha's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. She had been with the Holloway family since Catherine was a child. She knew the temperature of the house better than the thermostat did. She knew a storm was coming. An hour later, Emily Price entered the library. Emily wasn't a high-priced corporate shark like Bradford Keynes. She was a contract lawyer who specialized in estate law, a woman who wore tweed jackets and comfortable shoes. She had been Elias Holloway's personal attorney, and his father's before him. "He's moving, isn't he?" Emily asked, sitting in the wing-back chair, without waiting for an invitation. Catherine poured tea from a silver service. Her hands were steady. "He's liquidating assets in the Cayman accounts. He transferred the deed to the Aspen Lodge to a shell company yesterday, and Jessica Reed posted a photo on Instagram, wearing a ring that looks suspiciously like my grandmother's emerald captioned New Beginnings." Emily sighed, taking a file out of her briefcase. "The man is as subtle as a brick through a window. He thinks you're stupid, Cat." "He relies on it," Catherine said softly. She walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound volume of Shakespeare. Behind it was a safe. She spun the dial, left, right, left. April 12th, 19. The day her father died. The safe clicked open. Inside wasn't jewelry or cash. It was a single, yellowed document sealed in plastic. "Does he know this exists?" Emily asked, eyeing the document. "Richard." Catherine laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Richard never reads the footnotes, Emily. He looks at the bottom line. He thinks he took over my father's company because he was the chosen heir. He forgets that my father was a paranoid genius who trusted no one. Not even me, initially." Catherine placed the document on the table. It was the original charter of the Holloway Trust, dated 3 days before her marriage, to Richard. "He's going to serve me at the gala," Catherine stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "He wants a show. He wants the poor Richard, saddled with a crazy wife narrative, to play out in the press." Emily adjusted her glasses. "If he serves you there, and you sign the separation agreement he's drafted, are you sure about the timing?" "The timing has to be perfect," Catherine said, her eyes finally showing a glint of steel. "He needs to believe he has won. He needs to feel the victory in his teeth. Only then will he sign the counterproposal without reading it properly." "And if he reads it, he won't," Catherine said. "Because I'm going to give him exactly what he wants. I'm going to give him his freedom. I'm just going to change the price tag." The Dalton Holloway Charity Gala was the event of the Chicago social season. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel was dripping in crystals and gold. 500 of the city's elite were there. Senators, tech moguls, old money families, and the vultures of the press. Richard stood at the center of the room, holding court. He looked magnificent in a tuxedo that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Beside him, hovering just close enough to signal intimacy, but far enough to maintain plausible deniability, was Jessica Reed. She wore a red dress that was a declaration of war. Catherine arrived 20 minutes late. She wore black. Not a mourning dress, but a sleek architectural velvet gown that hugged her frame and pooled at her feet. She wore the Holloway diamonds, a necklace of staggering weight that had belonged to her great-grandmother. When she entered the room, went quiet. She looked regal, untouchable. Richard's jaw tightened. He had expected her to look frumpy, tired. Instead, she looked like a queen arriving to an execution. "She looks good," Jessica whispered, her voice laced with acid. "She looks like a relic," Richard snapped. He signaled to a man in a cheap grey suit standing near the orchestra pit. The process server. The music swelled. Richard took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming tonight to support the Arts Initiative. It has been a year of great change for Dalton Holloway. Innovation, growth, and looking toward the future." He made eye contact with Catherine, who was standing by the champagne tower. She raised her glass to him. "However," Richard continued, his voice taking on a somber, fake tone, "personal growth is also important. Sometimes paths diverge." This was the cue. The man in the grey suit walked across the dance floor. The crowd parted. The silence was deafening. He stopped in front of Catherine. "Catherine Dalton?" the man asked loudly. "Yes," she said, her voice calm. "You are served." He thrust a thick envelope into her hands. Gasps rippled through the room. A flashbulb went off, then another. It was a firing squad of cameras. Richard watched from the stage, feigning a look of regret. There it is, he thought. The breakdown. But Catherine didn't break down. She looked at the envelope, then looked up at Richard. She didn't scream. She didn't throw a drink. She simply nodded, as if she had just been handed a dry cleaning receipt. She walked up the stairs to the stage, the crowd parting for her, like the Red Sea. Richard stiffened. This wasn't in the script. She was supposed to run away, crying. Catherine reached the microphone. She placed the envelope on the podium. "Richard has a flair for the dramatic," she said into the mic, her voice smooth and amplified across the hall. "He always did love a captive audience." She turned to him, and for the first time Richard saw something in her eyes that scared him. It wasn't fear, it was pity. "I accept your terms, Richard," she said loud enough for everyone, including the press, to hear. "In fact, I anticipated them. My lawyer, Ms. Price, has the countersigned documents ready in the lobby. We can finish this tonight." She turned back to the crowd. "Enjoy the veal. It's excellent." And with that, she walked off the stage and out of the ballroom, leaving Richard standing there with a microphone in his hand, and a room full of people wondering who had actually just won the exchange. "What the hell was that?" Jessica hissed, grabbing Richard's arm as he stepped off the stage. "She's bluffing," Richard said, wiping sweat from his brow. "She's trying to save face. She said she accepts the terms. That's all that matters. Let's go to the boardroom. I want this done tonight before she changes her mind." The boardroom at the hotel was cold. Richard, Bradford, Jessica, Catherine, and Emily sat around the table. The festive sounds of the gala were muffled by the heavy doors. "Standard separation," Bradford said, sliding a new document across the table. "As served. You vacate the Lake Forest property within 30 days. You waive all rights to future earnings of Dalton Holloway. You retain your personal jewelry and the main cottage." Catherine didn't even look at the paper. She looked at Richard. "I'll sign it." "Just like that?" Richard asked, suspicious. "No fight for the pension, no alimony negotiation?" "I'm tired, Richard. Catherine said, sounding genuinely exhausted. "I just want out. I want to be done with you with her." She gestured vaguely at Jessica. "And with this life. But I have one condition." "Condition?" Bradford bristled. "You're not in a position to make demands, Mrs. Dalton." "It's a small one," Emily interjected, speaking for the first time. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It looked old. "Catherine wants to sever all ties, completely. That includes the Holloway Family Administrative Trust. She wants her name removed from it, entirely. She wants you to take full ownership of the trust and its liabilities." Richard frowned. He remembered the Holloway Trust. It was some archaic vehicle Elias had set up to manage the groundskeeping staff and the family mausoleum. It was a nothing entity. "That's it." Richard laughed. "You want me to take over the gardening bills? Fine. I'll take the trust. Put it in the agreement." "It's already there," Emily said, pointing to page 45, paragraph C. "Clause transfer of governance. Richard Dalton assumes full executive control and sole beneficiary status of the Holloway Family Administrative Trust and all assets and clauses contained therein." "Done," Richard said. He grabbed his Mont Blanc pen. "Read it, Rick," Bradford warned lazily. He skimmed the paragraph. "It looks standard, just transferring a trust entity, no financial exposure listed." Richard looked at Catherine. She was staring at her hands. She looked defeated. "I've won," he thought. "She's handing me everything, even the scraps." He signed the divorce decree with a flourish. Then Catherine took the pen. She signed her name. Catherine Holloway. Not Dalton. As soon as the ink dried, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Catherine sat up straighter. The slump in her shoulders vanished. She closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath and opened them. They were clear, bright, and terrifyingly calm. "Thank you, Richard," she said. "You have 30 days to move out." Richard gloated, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "Jessica has already picked out a decorator." "Actually," Catherine said, remaining seated, "you have 30 minutes." Richard froze. "Excuse me." Emily Price opened the folder she had been guarding. She pulled out the yellowed document from the safe, the one Catherine had shown her in the greenhouse. "You just signed the transfer of governance for the Holloway Trust," Emily said, her voice sharp. "You assumed all clauses contained therein. Did you ever bother to read the original 1999 Charter of the Holloway Trust, Mr. Dalton?" "It's a gardening fund," Richard scoffed, though a cold knot was forming in his stomach. "No," Catherine said softly. "It's a holding company. My father didn't trust you, Richard. He knew you were ambitious. So he put the ownership of Dalton Holloway, the intellectual property, the real estate, the voting shares, and the patents inside the trust. Richard turned pale. "That's a lie. I own the shares. I have the certificates." "You have the Class B shares," Emily corrected. "Dividend-yielding, non-voting revocable. The Class A governance shares were always held by the trust." "And here is the kicker," Catherine said, standing up. She walked around the table, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "The trust has a morality clause. My father was a very religious man. The clause states that if the beneficiary of the trust, which is now you, Richard, is proven to have committed adultery or files for divorce without just cause, as defined by the Church, the assets of the trust do not dissolve. They revert," Emily finished, "to the line of blood, meaning the direct biological descendants of Elias Holloway." The room was silent. Jessica looked from Richard to Catherine, her face draining of color. "What does that mean?" Jessica squeaked. Catherine smiled. It means Richard just signed a document acknowledging he is the beneficiary of the trust. We have the divorce filing he signed proving he initiated the split without just cause. Irreconcilable differences isn't enough for the trust. And we have the proof of his affair. Catherine tossed a flash drive onto the table. Thank you for the Instagram posts, Jessica. They were very helpful. So, Richard whispered, his voice trembling. The company. The trust owns the company, Catherine said. You violated the trust's charter. Therefore, the trust strips you of control. The assets revert to the bloodline. She leaned in close to Richard, her voice a whisper that sounded like a thunderclap. I own it all, Richard. The building we're standing in, the house in Lake Forest, the accounts in the Caymans, even the car you drove here in. It's all mine. The morning after the gala, the sun rose over Chicago, indifferent to the fact that the city's financial landscape had shifted on its axis overnight. Richard Dalton had not slept. He had spent the night in the presidential suite of the hotel, pacing the floor, his phone glued to his ear as he screamed at a rotating cast of junior associates. Bradford Keynes was gone, fired before the appetizers were cleared at the gala. Richard had replaced him with Garrison Ford, a litigator known in legal circles as the Butcher. Ford was a man who didn't care about the law. He cared about loopholes. It's a trust, Richard, not a deity. Ford barked over the speakerphone as Richard chugged his fifth espresso. Trusts can be pierced. We argue coercion. We argue that Catherine abandoned her duties. We argue that the morality clause is archaic and unenforceable in the 21st century. No judge in Illinois is going to strip a CEO of his company because he has a girlfriend. It's not just the company Garrison. Richard snapped, his voice hoarse. It's everything. I tried to log into my primary checking account this morning. Access denied. I tried to use the corporate jet to fly to New York to meet the investors. The pilot told me he takes orders from the trustee now. She has locked me out. It's a temporary restraining order, essentially. Ford soothed him. We go to court on Monday. We file an emergency injunction to restore your status quo. You walk back into that office on Tuesday. Trust me, trust. Catherine is a housewife. She doesn't have the stomach for a war of attrition. We will bury her in so much paper she'll beg to give you the company back, just to make it stop. Richard wanted to believe him. He needed to believe him. He showered, dressed in a fresh suit that Jessica had retrieved from a boutique downstairs since he couldn't go home, and marched toward the Dalton Holloway Tower. He needed to show strength. He needed to show the employees that he was still the alpha dog. He walked through the revolving doors of the skyscraper that bore his name. The lobby was bustling. Security guards stood by the elevators. Richard strode toward the private elevator bank, his chin held high. He swiped his key card. Beep. Red light. He swiped it again. Beep. Red light. Mr. Dalton. Richard turned. The head of security, a man named Miller, whom Richard had employed for 10 years, stood there. He looked uncomfortable. My card is demagnetized, Miller. Buzz me up. Miller didn't move. He clasped his hands behind his back. I can't do that, sir. Excuse me. Richard's voice rose, echoing in the marble lobby. People stopped walking. Heads turned. The building is currently under the management of the Holloway Trust, Miller said, reciting a script he had clearly been forced to memorize. We have been instructed that Mr. Richard Dalton is no longer an authorized employee. You are on the Do Not Admit list, sir. I own this building, Richard screamed, losing his composure. I built this company. I pay your salary. Actually, a calm voice cut through the noise. Catherine stepped out of the private elevator. She wasn't wearing the black velvet gown from the night before. She was wearing a cream-colored business suit, sharp and modern. Her hair was pulled back. She held a tablet in her hand. "The trust pays his salary, Richard," Catherine said, walking across the lobby. She stopped 5 feet from him. She didn't look angry. She looked busy. "And as of 8 a.m. this morning, I have been appointed as the interim trustee and acting CEO. You," Richard laughed, a manic, desperate sound. "You haven't worked a day in 20 years. You think you can run a Fortune 500 company. The board will eat you alive. The stock will tank." "The stock is up 4% since the market opened," Catherine said, glancing at her tablet. "Apparently the market reacts well to ethical restructuring. And the board, I had breakfast with them. They were surprisingly receptive when I showed them the forensic accounting of your business trips with Ms. Reed charged to the company credit cards." Richard went pale. "Embezzlement is a nasty word, Richard," Catherine whispered, stepping closer, so only he could hear. "But misappropriation of funds sounds just as bad in a deposition." "You can't do this," Richard hissed. "I already did," Catherine replied. She turned to Miller. "Please escort Mr. Dalton off the premises. If he returns, call the police." "Yes, ma'am." Miller stepped forward, his hand resting on his taser. "Sir, please." Richard looked around. His employees, people he had terrorized and belittled for years, were watching. Some were recording on their phones. There was no sympathy in their eyes, only the morbid curiosity of watching a king fall. Richard turned and walked out the revolving door, spinning him back out onto the cold street. The emergency hearing, 3 days later, was supposed to be a formality, according to Garrison Ford. It turned into a spectacle. The courtroom was packed. The press had smelled blood in the water. The headline, "Billionaire Locked Out by Scorned Wife," was too good to pass up. Judge Henrietta Vance presided. She was a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for despising corporate arrogance. Garrison Ford stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, this is a simple case of a vindictive spouse weaponizing an obsolete family trust to hold a public company hostage. My client, Richard Dalton, is the sole reason Dalton Holloway exists in its current form. To strip him of his assets based on a morality clause from the 1990s is not only absurd, it is unconstitutional." Ford was good. He was passionate. He painted Richard as the victim of an archaic, puritanical trap. Then it was Emily Price's turn. "Your Honor," Emily said, adjusting her glasses, "the defense argues that Mr. Dalton built the company. We do not deny his effort. We deny his ownership. The trust is clear. But we are not just here to enforce the morality clause. We are here to enforce the intellectual property assignment." Emily turned to the gallery. "Mr. Dalton believes that even if he loses the company, he can simply start over. He believes he owns the patents for the new eco-battery technology, that the company is about to launch a technology projected to be worth billions." Richard smirked from his table. He did think that. He had registered the patents under a personal LLC in Nevada, separate from Dalton Holloway. It was his golden parachute. However, Emily continued picking up a document. "I would like to enter into evidence Exhibit G, the Executive Employment Agreement signed by Richard Dalton 20 years ago." Ford jumped up. "Objection, relevance." "Overruled," Judge Vance said. "Proceed." When Richard Dalton married Catherine Holloway and took over the company, Emily explained, he signed a contract to become the caretaker of the Holloway legacy. Clause 14, subsection D. Emily projected the document onto the courtroom screens. "Any and all ideas, inventions, patents, or business ventures created, conceived, or developed by the executive during the tenure of his marriage to Catherine Holloway shall be considered work for hire and shall remain the sole inalienable property of the Holloway Trust. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. It wasn't a polite murmur. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the room. Richard froze. He stared at the screen. He remembered signing that. He had been 29, hungry, and in love, or at least in love with the idea of being rich. He had signed it without thinking, believing he would never divorce Catherine, or that he would eventually bully her into changing it. "This means," Emily said, her voice ringing with finality, "that the eco-battery patents in Nevada, they don't belong to Richard. They belong to Catherine. The shell companies he set up, they belong to Catherine. Every single idea he has had for the last 20 years belongs to the woman he just tried to discard." Richard looked at Garrison Ford. Is that legal?" Ford looked sick. "It's standard in high-level executive contracts, Rick, but usually they negotiate it out after 10 years. Did you never renegotiate your initial contract?" Richard hadn't. He had been too arrogant, assuming his status as CEO superseded the paper he signed as a junior executive. "Furthermore," Emily said, driving the final nail in the coffin, "since Mr. Dalton transferred those patents to a personal LLC, he has effectively stolen property from the trust. That is criminal fraud." The judge looked at Richard over her spectacles. The look was withering. "Mr. Ford," Judge Vance said, "I suggest you take a recess and explain to your client that he is dangerously close to being referred to the district attorney's office. The trust stands. The assets revert. Mrs. Dalton, excuse me, Mrs. Holloway retains full ownership." The recess was a bloodbath. Richard and Ford retreated to a small consultation room. The air conditioner hummed, but Richard was sweating through his shirt. "We settle," Ford said, loosening his tie. "Right now. You give up the fight for the company. You give up the patents. We beg for a cash settlement so you don't go to jail for fraud." "I have nothing," Richard whispered, staring at the wall. 20 years. I have nothing." "You have your freedom," Ford said dryly. "And you have Jessica. Maybe she can support you for a while." Richard looked up. "Where is Jessica?" She had been in the courtroom gallery sitting behind him, but when they walked out, she hadn't followed them into the consultation room. Richard grabbed his phone. He dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. He opened his text messages. There was one new message from Jessica. Sent 10:45 a.m. "Rick, I just spoke to my lawyer. Given the fraud allegations regarding the patents, I can't be associated with you. It would kill my career in PR. I'm flying to LA. Don't contact me. I'm sorry. Jay." Richard stared at the phone. He laughed. It was a broken, jagged sound. The woman he had destroyed his marriage for, the woman he had risked his empon for, had fled the moment the check bounced. The door to the consultation room opened. It wasn't Ford returning. It was Catherine. She entered alone. She closed the door and locked it. Richard looked at her. He expected her to gloat. He expected her to scream. Instead, she sat down opposite him. She looked calm, composed, and terribly sad. "Why didn't you just ask?" she said quietly. "Ask what?" Richard rasped. "If you were unhappy. If you wanted to leave. Why did you have to try to destroy me? Richard, why did you have to humiliate me?" Richard put his head in his hands. "Because I was afraid of you. I knew if you ever realized your power, You wouldn't need me anymore. I wanted to make sure you were too broken to fight back." "You forgot who raised me," Catherine said. "Elias Holloway was a shark, Richard. But he taught me that the most dangerous shark is the one that stays still until it bites." She slid a piece of paper across the table. "What is this?" "A settlement," Catherine said. "I'm not going to send you to jail, Richard. I don't want the father of my—" "Well, we never had children, thank God, but I don't want the man I shared my life with rotting in a cell. It's bad for the brand." Richard looked at the paper. It was generous, shockingly generous. It gave him a small apartment in the city paid for. It gave him a monthly stipend enough to live comfortably, but not enough to be a player. And it required him to step down from all public life. "Why?" Richard asked, tears welling in his eyes. "I tried to take everything from you." "Because I'm not you," Catherine said, standing up. "And because the best revenge isn't seeing you suffer. It's seeing you irrelevant. Sign it, Richard, and then disappear." Richard signed. His hand shook. The confident signature from the boardroom was gone, replaced by the scrawl of a beaten man. The transition didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, grinding tectonic shift that reshaped the Chicago skyline. 1 year had passed since the gavel fell in Judge Vance's courtroom. 12 months since the name Dalton was scraped off the bronze placards of the skyscraper on Wacker Drive, replaced by the elegant, understated typography of the Holloway Group. For Catherine, it had been a year of breathless acceleration. For Richard, it had been a year of suffocating stillness. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of Chicago day where the wind whipped off the lake with the force of a physical blow. Inside the 45th floor boardroom, however, the air was still and scented with fresh lilies. Catherine sat at the head of the table. The heavy mahogany chair once Richard's throne had been replaced. Catherine preferred a sleek, ergonomic Eames chair, something modern, functional, and transparent. "The Q3 projections for the eco-battery division are conservative," Catherine said, her voice cutting through the room. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. When she spoke, the room leaned in. Around the table sat 12 board members. 6 of them were new appointees, women and men from diverse backgrounds, experts in renewable energy and ethical governance. The other 6 were holdovers from Richard's era men in grey suits who still looked at Catherine as if she were a temporary glitch in the system. George Langley, a man who had been Richard's golf partner for 15 years, cleared his throat. He tapped his pen on the table, a nervous tick that Catherine had learned to ignore. "Catherine." Langley started, his tone patronizingly soft. "We all appreciate the enthusiasm behind the Green Initiative. But let's be realistic. The Asian markets are volatile. Richard always said that pivoting away from the core logistics model was suicide. We're exposing the company to unnecessary risk." The room went quiet. The ghost of Richard Dalton had just been invoked. In the early days, this would have silenced Catherine. It would have made her doubt her instincts. Today, she simply took a sip of her sparkling water. "Richard also said that the internet was a fad. In 1998, George," Catherine replied, her eyes locking onto his. A few of the newer board members stifled chuckles. "And Richard leveraged this company's assets to fund personal vanities, leaving us with a debt-to-equity ratio that was frankly embarrassing. My enthusiasm, as you call it, has reduced that debt by 40% in 8 months. She swiped her tablet, projecting a graph onto the smart glass wall. The line was green, and it was climbing steeply. "The eco-battery isn't a risk," she continued, standing up and walking to the window. She looked out at the city she now effectively helped power. It's the future. We secured the government contracts yesterday. The Department of Defense is our primary client as of 8 a.m. this morning. Langley's jaw dropped. The DoD contract. But Richard spent 5 years trying to land that. Richard tried to bribe his way into that contract. Catherine corrected, turning back to face them. I earned it. The sheer efficiency of the Holloway tech speaks for itself. We are no longer a logistics company that dabbles in tech. We are an innovation firm that masters logistics. She placed her hands on the table, leaning forward. Now, if there are no further nostalgic anecdotes about my ex-husband's failed strategies, I'd like to move to the vote on the expansion of the Lake Forest Research Facility. Do I have a motion? So moved, 3 people said in unison. Seconded, Langley mumbled, defeated. As the meeting adjourned and the suits filed out, Emily Price remained. She was no longer just an outside counsel. She was the chief legal officer. She looked tired, but victorious. You eviscerated him, Emily noted, organizing her files. Langley is going to retire within the month. I can feel it. Good, Catherine said, rubbing her temples. I need people who look forward, not backward. Speaking of the past, has the transfer been finalized? Emily paused. She knew what Catherine was asking. Yes, the monthly stipend was deposited into Richard's account this morning. The settlement agreement is fully executed. You don't have to think about him anymore, Cat. Catherine looked at the empty chair at the end of the table. I don't think about him, Emily. I just want to make sure he stays gone. 3 miles north, in a neighborhood that was respectable but far from luxurious, Richard Dalton sat in a booth at a diner called Lou's. The vinyl seat was cracked, pinching his thigh. The coffee in front of him was lukewarm and tasted faintly of dish soap. He wore a suit, but it was one of his older ones, a charcoal grey number that was slightly too large now. He had lost weight. Stress had carved hollows into his cheeks, and his once immaculate silver hair was thinning, lacking the expensive salon treatments he used to receive bi-weekly. He checked his phone. No notifications. A year ago, his phone would have been buzzing incessantly. Calls from brokers, texts from Jessica, emails from senators. Now the only email he had received today was a generic rejection from a mid-tier consulting firm in Milwaukee. Dear Mr. Dalton, while your experience is impressive, we feel your management style does not align with our current company culture. Code for, we know you're toxic, Richard muttered, deleting the email. He picked up the local newspaper left on the table by a previous patron. He usually avoided the news, but the headline stared up at him, mocking him. Holloway Group shares hit record high after defense deal. There was a picture. It was Catherine. She was wearing a white coat, standing in a high-tech lab, pointing at a prototype. She looked radiant, powerful, younger somehow than she had looked during their entire marriage. Richard felt a bile rise in his throat. That was my deal, he thought. I laid the groundwork for the DoD contacts. I did the networking dinners. She just walked in and signed the paper. He slammed the paper down, startling the waitress. More coffee, hon? She asked, chewing gum. She had no idea who he was. To her, he was just another out-of-work businessman, nursing a $2 refill. No, Richard snapped. Then, catching himself, he lowered his voice. No, thank you. Just the check. He fumbled in his wallet. He had to be careful. The stipend Catherine's lawyers had negotiated, the mercy clause, they called it, was $5,000 a month. To a normal person, it was a livable wage. To Richard Dalton, whose monthly wine budget used to be $10,000, it was poverty. He placed a $5 bill on the table and walked out into the grey drizzle. He had a meeting. It wasn't a job interview. It was worse. He took the bus, a humiliation he still hadn't gotten used to, down to the Loop. He walked 2 blocks to a trendy bistro, where he was meeting the one person who had agreed to see him. Bradford Keynes, his old lawyer, the man who had botched the prenup, or at least that was how Richard chose to remember it. Bradford was already there, sitting at a window table looking flush and happy. He was drinking a Pinot Noir that Richard knew cost $20 a glass. Rick Bradford waved him over. "God, you look rested." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Richard sat down. "Cut the crap, Brad. I need a favor." Bradford's smile faltered. "Rick, we've been over this. I can't represent you. Conflict of interest plus, well, your reputation is radioactive right now." "I don't need representation," Richard hissed, leaning in. "I need a contact. I have an idea. A new logistics algorithm. It's better than what Holloway is using. If I can just get in front of some venture capital guys, I can build a competitor. I can crush her." Bradford sighed, putting his wine glass down. He looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Rick, stop. It's over." "It's not over. I built that empire." "You managed it," Bradford corrected. "Elias Holloway built it. Catherine saved it. And you—" "You're done, Rick. Look, I didn't come here to talk business. I came here to give you a heads up. Professional courtesy." "Heads up on what?" Bradford gestured toward the door. "Don't look now, but Jessica is back in town." Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. Jessica, the woman who had abandoned him the moment the assets were frozen, the woman he still stupidly dreamt about. Does she want to see me?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with a pathetic hope. Bradford grimaced. "Not exactly. She's engaged, Rick." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "Engaged to who, some influencer?" "No," Bradford said, taking a long sip of wine. "To Marcus Thorne." Richard gripped the edge of the table. Marcus Thorne was Richard's nemesis, the CEO of Thorne Logistics, his biggest rival for the last decade. A man Richard had insulted publicly a dozen times. "She's with Thorne," Richard whispered. "They're getting married next month, at the Four Seasons. It's going to be the wedding of the year. And Rick, she's using the story. She's pitching a memoir. Surviving the Tyrant, My Escape from Richard Dalton." The room spun. It wasn't enough that he had lost his money, his company, and his wife. He was now the villain in someone else's fairy tale. He was the punchline. Richard stood up, his legs shaking. "I have to go." "Rick, sit down. Have a drink," Bradford called out. But Richard was already pushing through the door, stumbling back out into the cold, wet reality of a city that no longer cared if he lived or died. That evening, the atmosphere at the Lake Forest estate was worlds away from Richard's despair. The estate which Richard had always found drafty and depressing was alive with light. Lanterns hung from the ancient oak trees. A string quartet played Debussy on the patio. It was the New Leaf Gala, a fundraiser for urban gardens that Catherine had founded. Catherine moved through the crowd in a dress of emerald green silk, a subtle nod to the color of money, or perhaps just life. She wore the Holloway diamonds, but she wore them differently now, not as heavy shackles of tradition, but as armor. "Catherine, darling." She turned to see Emily Price approaching with a glass of champagne. Next to her was the mayor of Chicago. "Mr. Mayor," Catherine smiled, shaking his hand. "I hope you're enjoying the evening." "It's spectacular, Ms. Holloway," the mayor said. "And I must say the city is grateful for the job creation your new facility is promising. 500 jobs. 600, Catherine corrected gently. And full benefits. We believe that a secure workforce is a productive one." "Remarkable," the mayor beamed. "If only more CEOs thought like you." As the mayor drifted off to mingle, Emily clinked her glass against Catherine's. "You're a natural. You know Richard used to sweat through his shirts at these things. You haven't even checked your makeup." "I have nothing to hide, Emily," Catherine said, looking out over the garden. "Richard was always performing. He was always terrified someone would see the imposter underneath. I'm just me." She walked away from the party for a moment, drawn to the greenhouse. This was her sanctuary, the place where she had pruned her bonsai trees while her marriage disintegrated. She entered the glass structure. The air was warm and humid, smelling of earth and orchids. On the central table sat the bonsai she had been trimming the day she decided to destroy Richard. It was a juniper, twisted and gnarled, but strong. It had grown. Its leaves were a vibrant, healthy green. "You look happy." Catherine didn't jump. She turned slowly. Standing in the doorway of the greenhouse was not Richard. He wouldn't dare step foot on the property, but her reflection in the glass, and behind it, the silhouette of a man she hadn't seen in years. It was Julianne, her college sweetheart. The man she had left because her father insisted she marry a shark like Richard to protect the company. Julianne was now a professor of botany at the University of Chicago. "Julianne," Catherine smiled, a genuine, soft smile that reached her eyes. "You came." "I got an invitation," he said, stepping into the light. He looked older, wore tweed and had kind eyes. "I assumed it was a mistake." "No mistake," Catherine said. "I'm looking for a consultant for the new rooftop garden projects. I need someone who understands roots." Julianne laughed, a warm sound. "I think I can help with that." They stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable, not heavy. It was the first time in 20 years Catherine felt the possibility of a future that wasn't dictated by duty or defense. The night ended, as all nights do, but the feeling of triumph lingered. At 11 p.m., Catherine sat in the back of her town car. Her driver, a stoic man named Thomas, was navigating the slick streets back toward the city penthouse where she stayed during the work week. The rain had intensified. It blurred the neon lights of Chicago into streaks of color. As the car idled at a red light on Michigan Avenue, Catherine looked out the window. The street was empty, save for a few stragglers running for cover. And then she saw him. He was standing under the awning of a closed department store. He was holding a broken umbrella, struggling to get it open against the wind. A gust blew his hat off, sending it tumbling into a puddle. He chased after it, his movements stiff and desperate. When he bent down to pick it up, the light from a passing bus illuminated his face. It was Richard. He looked soaked, pathetic. He wiped the muddy hat on his coat, looked around to see if anyone had witnessed his indignity, and then placed it back on his head. He looked older than his 53 years. He looked like a man whose soul had been repossessed. Catherine's hand went to the window switch. For a split second, an old instinct flared, the instinct of the wife. He's cold. I should offer him a ride. I should help him. She watched him shiver. She remembered the nights he had come home late, smelling of Jessica's perfume, and lied to her face. She remembered the sneer in the boardroom when he told her she was nothing. She remembered the way he had looked at her at the gala, like she was a piece of furniture he was throwing out. The light turned green. "Miss Holloway?" Thomas asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. He had seen the man, too. He knew who it was. "Do you want me to stop?" Catherine looked at Richard one last time. He was staring at the ground, defeated, waiting for a bus that would take him to a lonely apartment in a life he hated. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a man who had made a bet against the wrong woman. Catherine inhaled. The air in the car smelled of expensive leather and her own lavender perfume. It smelled of freedom. "No, Thomas," Catherine said, her voice steady and final. "Keep driving." She turned away from the window opening, her tablet to review the morning's agenda. The car accelerated smoothly, the tires hissing on the wet pavement, leaving Richard Dalton behind in the rain, a small grey figure disappearing into the rearview mirror, and then into the past. The story of Catherine Holloway isn't just about a divorce. It's about the reclamation of self. Richard Dalton spent 20 years building a fortress of arrogance, never realizing that the foundation Catherine was the only thing holding it up. When she walked away, she didn't just take the money. She took the gravity that held his world together. It's a brutal reminder that in life and business, the person you underestimate is the one who can hurt you the most. Richard thought silence was submission. He learned too late that it was strategy. "What do you think? Did Catherine go too far by taking everything? Or did Richard get exactly what he deserved? I want to hear your verdict in the comments below. Team Catherine or Team Mercy? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please smash that like button. It helps us bring more of these twisted real-life dramas to you. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, stay sharp, and always, always read the fine print.